This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
The question of cosmic chemistry, do science and God mix? One of the world's leading philosophers, Alvin Plantinga, in a seminal book on this topic, Where the Problem Really Lies, recently said, there is a superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion. But there's a superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism. So what I'm going to suggest tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is the provocative thesis that the problem is with the cosmic chemistry is that atheism and science do not mix, but the belief in God and science mix perfectly well. Now, there's a widespread impression in our society, in Western countries, that there is an essential conflict between belief in God and scientific activity. That cannot really be the case, as is obvious from, say, last year's Physics Nobel Prize, won by Peter Higgs, who predicted the existence of the Higgs boson. He's an atheist. The prize was won a few years before that by William Phillips. He's a Christian. Now, it's obvious from thinking about that what divides these two men is not their physics. They've each won the Nobel Prize. You can do no better than that. But what divides them is their worldview. Higgs, an atheist, and Phillips, a Christian. And what I would suggest in this whole debate is it's not really a conflict between science and faith in God at all. It's a conflict between two worldviews, diametrically opposed. One claims that this universe or multiverse is all that exists. There's no transcendence, there's no God. And another worldview which says there is a God who created and sustains the universe. And you will find scientists of high distinction on both sides of the divide. So perhaps it's best to rephrase the question and say, well, where does science point, if anywhere? Does it really point towards atheism, as Richard Dawkins suggests, or does it point towards theism? And I want to say some things about why I think it points towards theism. Now, I'm a pure mathematician, and so I'm not this evening going to speak of proof in the mathematical sense, because you only get it in pure mathematics, and that would bore you to tears. Proof in the ordinary sense, we don't regard in that same rigorous light as we do in a mathematical system of proof that assumes certain axioms, proceeds by agreed logic to certain conclusions. No, we talk about evidence, pointers, and we come to conclusions that we hope are beyond reasonable doubt. But in saying that, we need to be aware, of course, that that doesn't mean we cannot stake our life on some of the conclusions we come to. Tomorrow morning, I've got to stake my life on a jet aircraft. I can't prove to you mathematically it's going to get me to Vancouver. I can only accept the evidence as it points to at least the reasonableness of me trusting that plane to get me there. And so it is in life. I've been married for 46 years to the same woman. I can't prove yet mathematically that she loves me. But I would stake my life on the fact that she does. So let's realize that although we're limiting the strength of our conclusions, we're not limiting them all that much. And even pure mathematics has its problems, as the experts know. So let's adduce the evidence. First of all, from the history of science, and then from the philosophy of science. And here's a very fascinating fact. Modern science exploded in Western Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries under people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Pascal, Boyle, Faraday, and so on. Every single one of them a believer in God. And that has led many historians of science, in fact most, and philosophers of science, to the conclusion that there's an intimate connection between faith in God and the rise of modern science. C.S. Lewis, as usual, put it very pithily. He said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, far from faith in God being a hindrance to science, it was the motor that drove it. And of course, that immediately leads to a very interesting question. How is it that Newton believed in God, and as the centuries roll past, we come to the situation where Stephen Hawking, who until recently occupied Newton's chair at Cambridge, says that there is no God, and therefore we must choose between science and God. And I hope that by trying to unpack why that has happened and how it has happened, we'll at least get a way into the topic. And then, of course, I'm going to be much more interested in the questions that are to be asked. But let me state quite clearly, I'm not remotely embarrassed to be both a scientist and a Christian, because it is arguable that Christianity gave me my subject. The God hypothesis founded the base for the faith that the universe is rationally, indeed mathematically intelligible. So why is it we get Stephen Hawking, for instance, asking us to choose between science and God? Well, sometimes scientists use their authority to make statements that do not have the authority of science. Putting that another way, statements of scientists are not always or necessarily statements of science. So when Carl Sagan began his TV series Cosmos with the statement, the universe that all that is, was, or ever shall be, that's a statement by a scientist, but it is not a statement of science. And so we need to be aware of that. And I'm very aware of it because we all go outside our own field. That makes life interesting. But of course, when we go outside our own field, as I'm doing tonight, we need to check up on the evidence coming from the experts in the field we're stepping into. Now, let's start with the science of psychology, where we're told by Richard Dawkins that God is a delusion, like Santa Claus, like our belief in Santa Claus. I find that strange, and I've met it recently quite frequently in debate with senior scientists. I find it strange because, as I often challenge an audience, who of you came to believe in Santa Claus as an adult? And I've never yet met one. But I've met thousands of people who came to believe in God as an adult. And so to simplistically put God and Santa Claus into the same class is rather naive. But of course, I understand that behind it is Freud's idea that belief in God is really a fantasy. It's a wish projection. We're not adequate in ourselves, and we need something outside ourselves in which we can trust. As Stephen Hawking himself put it, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. Now, Dawkins is not a psychiatrist, nor am I. And accusing people who believe in God of delusion is imposing a psychiatric description on them. So I thought I would consult a psychiatrist. And I read the best-selling book by Manfred Lutz, A Brief History of the Great One, German top psychiatrist. And he says, of course, if there is no God, then Freud's argument is brilliant, that religion is a wish fulfillment, a projection of the desire to have a father figure in the sky, if there is no God. But then he goes on to say, of course, if there is a God, the very same argument shows you that atheism is a projection of the desire not ever to have to give account, not ever to face the consequences of our messing up of life, of our evil desires, our murders, and so on, if there is a God. And his bottom line is, Of course, on the question whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, or Frankl can help you at all. So I was asked to reply to Stephen Hawking's little quip, "Religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark." And so I said, "Atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light." Well, you shouldn't clap, really, because if you followed my argument, you'll see it proves nothing either way. So let's proceed now to the next point. I used to think that a lot of this false dialogue, setting up a false alternative, science or God, had to do with misunderstandings of science. I've now come to the conclusion that it's a bit more subtle than that. It is firstly to do with confusion about the nature of God. Now that might surprise some of you. But you see, it is customary these days to put the God of the Bible into the Greek pantheon and to suggest that the God who created and sustains the universe is just a God like the Greek God of thunder, just a God of the gaps. And we all know that if you do a course on atmospheric physics at the University of Sydney, the Greek God of thunder will disappear in lecture 1. A little bit of understanding of temperature gradients, of electrical discharges and so on, and that God's gone. And so there's a habit of thought developed to accuse people like me of just believing in some kind of unknown X, let's say God, who holds the fort until science has expanded into where the unknown is and the God disappears, a God of the gaps. Well, I don't believe in a God of the gaps. I believe in a God of the whole show. That is, a God who is the God of the bits of the universe I do understand and the bits I don't. And you see, once you get that, you'll see that God is not under threat from every advance in science. So the first thing to get clear is to remove the fog about God. We're not claiming that God is simply an explanation for what science cannot yet explain. And that leads me to the next level of confusion. And it is that God as an explanation is exactly the same as science as an explanation, so that by definition they compete. Let me put it this way. If you believe in a God of the gaps, then you have to choose between science and God, because that's the way you've defined God. It's as simple as that. And that is the force behind a lot of the pressure coming from leading intellectuals. You must choose between science and God, because they have come to a false conclusion about God. They've defined God in such a way that you've got to make that choice. But I want to submit, ladies and gentlemen, they're totally wrong about God. You see, let's compare that attitude with Isaac Newton. When he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, "I have a law of gravity, I don't need God." Stephen Hawking does. He says, because there is the law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. When I first read that sentence, I was staggered. And I thought I would submit it, like most other things I read, to logical analysis. Because there is a law of gravity, because there's something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. That's a flat contradiction. And it's worse still, isn't it? The universe will create itself. If I say to you, X creates Y, I mean, roughly speaking, if you've got X, it'll produce Y. If I say X creates X, it means roughly if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it means to me that nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered scientists write it. So this idea of Hawking's to counteract Newton's reaction is illogical, apart from anything else. It's incoherent. It doesn't make any sense at all. But it makes a fundamental mistake. You see, when Newton discovered his law, he didn't say, well, I don't need God anymore. I've got a law. That's what Hawking's saying. No, he said, what a brilliant God it is who did it that way. The more he understood of how the universe worked, the more he admired the God who'd done it that way. And of course that's true of many areas of life, isn't it? The more you know of engineering, the more you can admire a Rolls-Royce engine. The more you know of painting, the more you can admire a Rembrandt. And so the more Newton understood, the more he admired the God that did it that way, and he put that into his famous book, the most famous in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, expressing explicitly the desire that people reading it might come to believe in a deity. So what we're talking about here, all the time actually, is the nature of explanation. The nature of explanation. What do we mean when we say science explains? Think of the law of gravity again, since we're talking about it. What does the law of gravity explain? Well, the one thing it doesn't explain is gravity, of course. Nobody knows what gravity is. Do you know, I wish I'd been taught that at school. I thought the law of gravity told us what gravity was, but it doesn't. Now, don't misunderstand me, it's brilliant. Mathematics is the art of compressibility, and you think an equation with 8 symbols in it can be used to do mathematical calculations that will tell you what the ellipses of the planets are around the sun, will even enable you to land a person on the moon without Einstein's corrections. It's brilliant insight, staggering intellectual achievement. But Newton realized it didn't tell him what gravity was. And it was Wittgenstein who put it best of all, I think. He said the greatest deception of modernism is the idea that the laws of nature explain the world to us, when all they do is describe structural regularities. So even at its own level, you have to be extremely careful with the statement science explains, because you're only getting a one-level explanation usually, and not a complete explanation. Simple example, of course, is why is the kettle boiling? Well, because the heat energy is agitating the molecules of water, and they're beginning to spit off, and steam pressure is building up, and so on and so forth. No, it isn't. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now, we laugh at that in its simplicity, but this is a profound thing, because you can immediately see, I hope, that those two explanations do not conflict, they don't compete, they complement. But they're different kinds of explanation. The first one is a scientific explanation in terms of laws and mechanisms. The second is an agent mechanism. And you see, I want to submit to you that God no more competes with science as an explanation than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car engine. And what is being suggested to you by many of these people is precisely that. You're being asked to choose between Henry Ford and internal combustion. You'd never dream of doing it. And interestingly enough, I find kids at school often can understand it better than professors. They see the difference in the different level of explanation. Now, of course, once you start on that line, you meet objections. And there are two principal ones coming, not surprisingly, from Richard Dawkins and now from many other people. I met at least one of them last time I was in a town hall here debating Peter Singer in Melbourne. If you believe that God created the universe, you'll have to ask who created God. And then you'll have to say who created the creator that created, and so on forever. And that's nonsense, so it would be better to go back to doing something serious like playing Australian rules football. But just a moment. A little bit of logic will soon deal with that. If you ask who created God, that is a sentence of the type, who or what created X? It assumes, of course, obviously, that X was created. So if you ask who created God, you're assuming God was created. But what if he wasn't? Then the question simply doesn't apply. It only works with created gods. But the claim of the three great monotheistic religions, the biblical God, is that he is eternal. He wasn't created. So instead of dealing with the question of God, the question bypasses it completely. Now, there are several additional points to be made. The first is this. Since the question applies to created gods, I turned it round on Richard Dawkins. And I said to him, you believe the universe created you. And you believe your question is valid, so let me ask it. Who created your creator? I'm still waiting for an answer, and it's 8 years ago I asked the question. You see, what this is really about philosophically is there an ultimate reality? And what I find is that with most of my atheist friends, the questioning stops. The questions don't go back forever. They come to a full stop with the universe, the multiverse, or mass energy. That's the ultimate explicator of everything. For a Christian like me, of course, the ultimate is God. So the question to be decided is not, is there an ultimate reality, but which reality is ultimate? Now, probing a little bit more in this direction, Richard has a related question. He said, look, let's look at this a different way. If you postulate that God created the universe, then by definition, God is more complex than the thing you're explaining. So he can't be an explanation at all, because explanation, by definition, moves from the simple to the complex. Now, we're probably very familiar with this. It's called reductionism. Turning it upside down, the idea is that you get simpler and simpler explanations for bits of a thing from the bottom up. You reduce everything, in other words, to physics and chemistry. And the trouble is, we're often told at school and university that that is the nature of scientific explanation. Well, it is for a lot of scientific explanation, but it's not for everything. And there's one vastly important exception, which I can illustrate with Richard Dawkins again. His book, The God Delusion, is quite complex. It's got about 400 pages in it. So I ask, of course, what is the origin of this text? And somebody suggests to me it originated in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. So I reject that explanation, since it's more complex than the thing you're explaining. You see, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because the thing we're talking about is a linguistic phenomenon. It has a language dimension. Now, this fascinates me. And of course, it's true to our experience. You imagine, I go to China, and I'm taken into a cave by a Chinese archaeologist, and there are all kinds of scratches on it. And as he walks through a cage, I see a very simple scratch. One goes down to the left like that, and from the middle, there comes to the right like that. And I need to be careful, because I've got a Mandarin speaker right over here watching me. And as the Chinese archaeologist comes, he says, human intelligence. And I say, what do you mean, human intelligence? Those two scratches. I said, don't be ridiculous. They're only two scratches. And you're postulating something as complex as a human intelligence to account for them. And she looks at me from a great intellectual height. And she says, you've obviously never learned any Chinese. Because that, of course, is a symbol for a human being, run. And the only thing that can account for those two scratches is human intelligence. Fascinating, isn't it? You see your name written on Bondi Beach, and you'll immediately postulate intelligence. Now the fun starts. In a moment of magic, this Chinese archaeologist turns into an Oxford molecular biologist. And she takes me into her laboratory and shows me down a stereoscopic microscope that has not yet been invented, as you'll see in a moment. So as I look through this microscope, I see letters spitting off a long chain, C, G, A, G, C, T, A, G, T, C, A. And I say with my big wondering Irish eyes, what is that? Oh, she says, don't you know what that is? That's the human genome. These things are codons. Oh, I said, codons, they code for something, certainly. They have a semiotic dimension. They code for the proteins. And I say, look, this seems to be immensely long. Yes, he says, there are actually 3.5 billion of them. But I said, is the order important? You see? Oh, yes, he said, it's like a computer program, you see. And what's the origin of that, I say? And she says, chance and the laws of nature. I say, pardon? 3 seconds ago, we were in a cave in China. You saw 2 scratches. And you said because they had, if I understood you correctly, because they have a semiotic dimension, they demand human intelligence. Something odd is happening, ladies and gentlemen. When we see word, and we've come to the situation where we've discovered that the longest word we've ever discovered is in each one of the 10 trillion cells of our body. And when we see the tiniest words anywhere, in every case, without exception, except here, we ascribe it to intelligence. Why the double think? Well, it's obvious, of course. Because if you once introduce the idea of intelligence behind DNA, you will not escape the God question. Oh, but you say this is intelligence of the gaps. No, it isn't. You would never, as you look at those words there, City Bible Forum, you immediately see an intelligence has been responsible for that. You wouldn't let me away with the idea, don't be silly. You're postulating an intelligence of the gaps. Of course you're not. What you're doing is saying, you instantly perceive, even though you may never have articulated it like that physics and chemistry is powerless to explain the semiotic dimension of the way in which those words convey meaning to your mind. And so you postulate an intelligence. I simply want to apply the same argument to the longest word we have ever seen. Now this leads me to the last major point. It began, oddly enough, with Darwin. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? That argument is now mainstream in the philosophical world because leading thinkers like Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist, by the way, in America, says we have done a lot of good science by thinking, but what we haven't done is think about thinking. Because the moment you begin to think about thinking, you have to come to this basic scientific credo. Why do I trust my mind? Now, I often talk to my atheist colleagues. In fact, I do it all the time. So I say, you know, you're doing science with your mind. What is the mind? Well, it's the brain. Oh, what's the brain? Well, the short story is, it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I said, and you trust it. You wouldn't dream of trusting your computer if you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Now, this is being treated very seriously. Google Thomas Nagel and his book with the explosive title, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the Universe is Almost Certainly False. And what he says is this. He says that if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Come back to the worldviews as I close. One starts with mass energy, and everything, including mind, is derivative. The other starts, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. And it's not merely as a Christian, but as a scientist. I find that second view infinitely preferable. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me that the cosmic chemistry of atheism and science doesn't work, for the simple reason that when it comes to dealing with our human rationality on which we depend to do science, atheism doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot. That's painful. It shoots itself in the brain, which is fatal. Thank you very much.
Are you ready for some questions?
I'd love to hear some questions.
How do you define God, John?
First of all, I respond to this, and it's not an easy question, If you'd asked me how to define a human person, I would have equal difficulty. So how do I define God? Well, God for me is the God of whom the Bible claims he's the creator and the sustainer of the universe. And the words, particularly the verbs in which he's described in the early chapters of Genesis, God saw, God blessed, God said, and so on, are attributes of personality. So God is a person. Now, the biblical claim, whether it's true or false, but let's see what the claim is that human beings are made in the image of God and not the other way, as Freud suggested, so that we can learn a lot about God by looking at ourselves. So we are people capable of love, emotions, thought, and all this kind of thing. So although we can not capture God in any kind of box, it seems to me that the idea, and you get this even among the Greek philosophers, dear old Xenophanes, whom I love, protested against these Greek gods for the kind of reason I mentioned. You know, he said lions would believe in gods who looked like lions. But he said, I believe there's a God, there's one God, a single God of great power and so on. He had some sense looking at the universe that there was something glorious beyond it, there was something transcendent. Now, from the biblical perspective, looking at creation can give me pointers to the fact that there's a great being of rational power. I see the point I was making there, put in a different way, is simply the fact that we can do science indicates to me there's a rational mind behind the universe. And that mind is powerful, clearly, because it produced the universe. But you can't get any further than that, really, by looking at the universe. So now I come at it the other way round. And that's where my Christianity kicks in, which you may or may not want to talk about later. But the point is, I believe that the business of learning who God is like or what God is like is not a one-way activity. It's not me simply trying to understand what God is like. The central claim of Christianity is, of course, that God has become human in Jesus Christ. And therefore, if we want to know what he's like, we have a look at Jesus Christ, and that would lead to a whole thing. So that's the very shortest answer I can give you.
So just quickly, because we're going to have to be quick if we're going to get through some of the answers. John Shelby Spong defines God as a spirit,
yes,
the source of life, light, and love, and the ground of our being. Mm-hmm. Do you like that description?
That God is spirit, it's a biblical one. Yes, of course, that he is the ground of our being. You know, there's a lovely statement by one of my colleagues at Oxford, Richard Swinburne. He says, I believe science explains. I postulate God to explain why science explains. And that sense that he is the ground, the personal ground of our being, is, of course, something that is clearly biblical.
John, you were born in Northern Ireland, a Protestant household in Armagh. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing, who your parents were, and how your understanding of God was when you were a child.
Can I just give one little corrective? We'd have never described ourselves as Protestant because we weren't protesting against anything. That was part of the problem in our country, that both sides were protesting very strongly about things. And I say that because it's made a deep impression on me. My father was a Christian, a very deeply convinced Christian, as was my mother, but he wasn't sectarian. And that was very unusual. And he practiced that by, in his small store, country store, the kind that's been swept aside by supermarkets, he had 40 or 50 people. And because he believed that human beings were made in the image of God, he employed equally across the religious divide and was bombed for it. So that was a very impressive thing. The second extremely impressive thing was that he allowed me to think. And that was unusual. I mean, when I was about 13 or 14, he said, by the way, have you ever read the Communist Manifesto? I said, no. Well, he said, here's one. I think you should read it. You need to know what other people think. And so I grew up in a home where Christianity was the most intellectually stimulating thing around.
Just going back to that point, you said your father was bombed for it. Can you tell us about that event?
Yes, my brother was nearly killed. They put 300 stitches in his face and just managed to survive. You know, some chap was paid £100 to put a bomb in the shop. The IRA. But it's tragic, you know.
Did it not leave some kind of an impression
Oh, it
with
left
you
terrific
about...
scars, particularly on my brother, but he didn't lose his faith in God, which is quite remarkable. Of course it left scars. But the fact that my brother, who's quite a diffident man, held on to his faith in God through that, I found a very strengthening thing. You know, that there are ways of coping. And of course, I've seen that many times since.
So you were brought up in an environment of knowledge, of questioning.
Yes.
What about your love of languages? How did you get that?
Well, you see, I discovered I was quite good at Latin. I loved it. I loved the grammar and so on and so forth. So my first thing was I wanted to be a Latinist. And then I had a very good maths teacher. And he got me engaged in mathematics. And then I decided that I wanted to have a go at speaking modern languages. The French teacher was pretty good, but I became a radio amateur very young. And I discovered that I could talk from my home to Germany and France and so on. This was wonderful, because we couldn't afford to travel. So I could talk German as much as I liked and French just from the house. So I had a bit of fun saying, could you get O-level rapidly without going to the German class? So I did that, and that rather probably was a little bit cheeky for a chap my age, but the school allowed me to sit the exam without having gone to any classes. And that gave me a lifelong love for languages, and I wanted to be a linguist. But then the headmaster came and he said, Lennox, he said, you've got a scholarship to do electrical engineering, but you might get into Cambridge, but only if you did maths, because we don't have people that can teach physics and chemistry to the required level. So I consulted around and concentrated in maths, and I'm glad I did.
Well, you might have concentrated on maths, but you have a fair few postgraduate degrees.
Perishing by degrees.
Including bioethics.
Yes.
From Surrey.
Mm.
Maths was from Cardiff. You're a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford, an MA and a PhD from Cambridge. What's motivated you to gather credentials like that? Is it purely your love of learning?
Well, you see, it's a bit of a cheat, really, you know. It all sounds very impressive, doesn't it? Doctorate from Oxford, doctorate from Cambridge. But I need to be honest with you. Oxford gave me it free. You see, when I went to Oxford, they didn't know what to do with me. And they said, the easiest thing would be if you had Oxford degrees. Now, because you've got a Cambridge degree, we can incorporate you. So I appeared before the Vice-Chancellor, and he found it very amusing. He started laughing in the middle of the ceremony when he gave to me in a great Latin spiel the same rights that I would have had I stayed at Cambridge. So I actually got those free. So they're not as impressive as you think.
Would it be so easy for everyone?
But you asked what motivated me, and that's curiosity and interest. I was taught to ask questions, and my great intellectual hero is Socrates. You know, and he found it was risky to ask questions. He was forced to commit suicide because of it. I haven't been yet. But asking the big questions, and I love the motto of the City Bible Forum, ask the bigger questions, because that's been the motivation of my life. Where do the humanities and mathematics sit inside the whole thing? What is the big picture? Is there a big picture? And that has really driven me, both in terms of my academic career, but also in my geographical wanderings to Eastern Europe and so on, because I was very interested to see what really happened in a culture that had atheism at its core. But that's another sort of phase of life.
Shall we go to a few of the questions
absolutely.
from our audience? And there's an interesting one here from a medical practitioner who says, I don't believe in the virgin birth, nor do I believe in the resurrection. I don't find it necessary to believe in life after death. However, I believe in the existence of Jesus and that there's a spiritual side to us that allows us to believe in God. Many Christians will exclude me. Am I a Christian? Dr. Don.
Well, you wouldn't want me to judge as to whether anybody is a Christian or not. So let me come to the more objective rather than subjective side of that. Jesus, his name means Saviour. I cannot conceive of that without his death and resurrection. And since he himself claimed that he would die and rise again, if the resurrection is false, I think his claim is fraudulent. So it seems to me that we're talking about the very heart of the Christian claim, that God became human. Now it's interesting that the questioner rejects the virgin. It's the virgin conception, actually. It wasn't a virgin birth. It was a conception that was a miracle. And the resurrection. Now, I can understand that because that's the argument I didn't deal with in my talk. That many people say, look, all this stuff is idle because you scientists believe in the laws of nature. Miracles violate the laws of nature, as David Hume said, so you can't believe in resurrections and so on. I could take a minute to deal with that. May I do that?
Please.
Well, I understand that, but Hume was wrong. Now, that sounds a very strong statement, but I happen to get to know Hume's leading atheist interpreter, Sir Anthony Flew, before he died. He was the Dawkins of a bygone generation. He came late in life to believe in a deity because of the argument I used about DNA, interestingly, and that infuriated his atheist colleagues. And I interviewed him not long before his death, and I said, what about David Hume and miracles? He said, Hume was wrong, and all my books are wrong, and I'd love to rewrite them, but I can't. The basic thing is this. You see, that we get confused about the two uses of the word law. The one, the laws of Sydney or the laws of Australia and the laws of nature. And I'll just give a very brief illustration, again due to Lewis, which shed light on it for me. I put $100 in the drawer of my desk last night in a hotel. I put $100 tonight. 1 + 1 is 2. I find $50 in my drawer tomorrow. Does that mean the laws of arithmetic are broken or the laws of Australia? It means the laws of Australia have been broken. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. You see, the issue here is I thought that drawer was a closed system. Nothing can get in from the outside. Now here's the real essential point of this. Many of my scientific friends who are atheists believe this universe is a closed system of cause and effect. But here's the irony. Hume used to say, and many of my colleagues say, it was okay for people in the 1st century to believe in a virgin birth. But we can't because we know the laws of nature. That's nonsense. Joseph, who was betrothed to Mary, knew exactly where babies come from. And when Mary said, I'm pregnant, and he said, well, how did that happen? Well, the Holy Spirit. He wanted to divorce her because he knew exactly where babies come from. And similarly, people in the 1st century knew that people don't just pop out of their graves. That's why they recognized the resurrection as a miracle. So the point I finally make is this. The resurrection of Jesus or his incarnation broke no laws. It's that this universe is not a closed system of cause and effect, so God by his power can feed an event in from the outside. It breaks no laws. When God coded himself into humanity, as Lewis points out, the laws take over, and 9 months later, exactly a baby is born. So I think this idea is false. So it's perfectly possible for a scientist, even a medical scientist, to believe in both the virgin conception and the resurrection.
So you don't want to pass comment on whether he should call himself a Christian or not?
Well, I think he must judge that on the basis of what I've just said.
Another question, I'm a good person and I live a moral life. Why should I follow the God of the Bible?
I'm a good person. Is that what you said?
Says this person, yes. It's not me.
Well, I'm delighted there's somebody in this audience who's good and feels that they don't need any kind of forgiveness or salvation. But I'm afraid I'm not good, and I do need forgiveness. And when we compare ourselves with one another, of course there's great goodness. And I think it's important that I step back from this just a sec so that I'm not misunderstood. Because I believe that all men and women, whether they believe in God or not, are made in the image of God. They're capable of goodness. And we see it. In fact, I'd go as far as to say this. I could easily be put to shame by my atheist friends or my friends from other religions. They've got a moral sense as well as I have. I mess up because I'm not perfect. Now, having said that, when I compare myself with others, I might feel, yeah, I'm okay. But if there is a God worthy of the name of God, that's a different matter altogether. And if I'm honest, I don't even keep my own standards, let alone God's standards. And you see, the trouble is, if there is a God, then ignoring him might be the worst possible thing. You see, the very first commandment, which gets omitted very often, is love the Lord your God with all your mind. Well, if you don't believe in God, of course you can't do that. But the point is, if there is a God, then our vertical relationship with God is actually more important than our horizontal relationships with other people. So what I say in answer to that question is, I want to know the truth about my situation. If I were lying on a beach in the sun, Bondi Beach, and you were on a cliff, and you noticed the sea was all around me, and in a few minutes I was going to drown, I would hope you'd tell me, I feel great, I don't need anything, life's terrific. But you see, I'm threatened by a danger. And, you know, I take very seriously the fact that one day I'm going to have to stand before God. On what basis will I stand? I can't stand on the basis of my own merit for 5 seconds. I may have done some good things, but I messed up in so many different things. And this is the wonderful thing about Christianity, actually, because what Christ offers us is forgiveness that's known now. And he's prepared to accept us if we repent and trust him. Those are very big things in my life. Now, they're very personal. But this is a personal question in that sense. The basis of relationship comes through what Christ has done and my trusting it, not on my merit. And the idea that I could one day stand before God on my merit is such a common idea, because people think of religion in general as a kind of university course. You know, you have some ceremony that gets you in, and then you have professors who are kind and they help you. But even they can't guarantee you'll get through finals, unfortunately. It's a merit system. And we often think of God like that. It's a merit system. I got to be good enough and so on. That's not Christianity. It points out you never will be good enough. And anyway, relationships cannot be based on merit. They can be based on trust.
Can I ask you, was there a time where you felt your faith was particularly challenged in your life?
Yes, almost every day of the week. In the sense, now I don't mean that to be trite, but you see, growing up in Ireland has certain disadvantages. And that was very manifest when I got to Cambridge, because in week one at table, I'd never forget it. A student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, I should never have asked you that question. You're Irish. And you all believe in God and fight about it." So the issue with which I began my lecture, the psychological one, has been a very big one. You know, my parents are Christian, my grandparents, and their parents. It's Irish genetics, that's it. So what did I do? On that day, I can remember it so clearly, I thought, do you know, I've never really got to know people in Ireland who are absolutely diametrically opposed to me. You know, I've met Protestant atheists and Catholic atheists, but no real atheists. So I'm glad they're still awake. So I sought out on that day and discovered one of my colleagues was agnostic. He'd never been to church and so on. So the dialogue started. And I decided on that day I was going to befriend these people, find out what made them tick, keep asking them questions, try and walk in their shoes, simply because I didn't want to be fooled. So it was the method of doubt, really. And I've spent my whole life doing it. So that, of course, there are times more than others where the questioning is fierce and you feel under pressure. But what I've discovered is, looking at it on the whole, that the more I've made myself vulnerable to questioning, some of it very hostile questioning, the stronger my faith in God has grown, my faith in Christ has grown, because I see that there are answers. And they're not coming from atheism, for instance. So it is built up. But perhaps you meant something a bit more specific than that.
I wonder if you've had an event in your life, a personal tragedy, that has caused you to question, to doubt, as opposed to the daily doubt that you clearly face because of your curiosity.
I have frequently asked the question, why? And I think the hardest problem we all face is the problem of suffering. I've been, well, you're asking something personal, so let me, I don't know whether this answers your question, but I've been in the position of having to say goodbye to my wife, given just a few seconds to live. I'm here, so they saved my life by wonderful medical intervention. And you know, a lot of things go through your mind when you're just given a minute or two to live. And you have to say goodbye, the door closes and you're on the operating table. But it's very interesting that I had total peace. I can't explain that. I knew I was going to see her again because we share the same faith in God. And she had total peace. And 40 minutes went by with utter silence. And then the surgeon leant over me and he said, you should be dead. There's no reason at all for you to be alive. Now, the flip side of that is, virtually the same time, my sister loses her 22-year-old just married daughter to a brain tumor.
Your niece.
Yes. And people say to me, do you thank God for the intervention? I said, of course I do, but what do I say to my sister? That's the harder thing. Now, she hasn't lost her faith, but boy, has she had to wrestle through very deep water. The reason I'm telling you that story is I've never faced that. Does that make sense?
It does. This is a question from the audience that plays into that somewhat. Do Jesus' miracles work outside the laws of science or miracles in general?
Well, let me try and re-explain it. I would claim that the miracles of Jesus do not break any laws of nature. Let me step back from it and try and explain it a bit better and more simply perhaps. And that is, I believe in a God who created and sustains the universe and has built into it certain regularities. These regularities we recognize and codify mathematically, and we call them laws. But they're not laws in the forensic sense, in the legal sense. They don't cause anything. Newton's laws of motion never caused a billiard ball to move in the history of the universe. They simply describe what normally happens. So we could say it's a law of nature that dead bodies don't rise from the dead. But it doesn't cause anything. That's simply a description of what normally happens. If you say, well, then dead bodies can't rise from the dead, you're moving beyond empirical law, of course, and you'd have to be able to say, well, we've investigated every tomb since the beginning of history and nobody's risen from the dead. But unfortunately, that's not true. There is one tomb that was carefully guarded, where somebody did rise from the dead and gave evidence for it. And that's the method of history. You've got a very gifted historian in this audience, an Australian, John Dixon. And on that topic, I would recommend people to watch the stuff he's done because it's enormously important. So you get at it historically, but it doesn't break any laws. So to say it's outside the laws, what do you mean? If you say it's outside what normally happens, yes, it is. But the laws aren't causing or preventing an event comes in from outside. But it's our knowledge of the laws that enables us to recognize it. You see, you cannot recognize an intervention, an input of God from outside if you don't know the laws. You've got to know them.
Another question from the audience. Do you think the church, the pioneers of science, has buried science due to lack of intellectual curiosity and broader engagement with the academic, intellectual and student community? And that's from Matthew.
Yes and no. It's such an important question. I think it's been a tragedy that in more recent years, there's been an anti-intellectual element within the professing Christian church. And I regard that as a scandal for a very simple reason. If the first commandment is to love the Lord your God with your mind, then not to love him with your mind is actually a sin. And when I look around Britain, Michael Burke did this survey a couple of years ago, The Soul of Britain. And he went around saying, why are you leaving the church? Number one answer was, they're not answering our questions. And I think it's a tragedy, because if you go back to the first few centuries, the Christians outthought the pagans. They were men of genius, towering intellects like Aquinas and Augustine and all this kind of thing. They were the real thinkers of the ancient world. And look at my university, Oxford. What's its motto? Dominus illuminatio mea. The Lord is my light or illumination. The people that founded our major universities were thinking Christians. It's an utter tragedy that somehow people got frightened of science in a way and started to batten down the hatches and started to stop young people asking questions. And that's why young people have very little interest, some of them, in the institutional church. They're still interested in the questions, I'm glad to say.
And why would you suggest that intellectuals, people in the church, had that fear of encouraging questions?
Oh, these are authority problems, aren't they, sometimes? You know, it's very difficult. I mean, I'm asked by many bishops, for instance, in England, to come and run courses on these questions for their ministers because they find themselves in the church. They're not scientifically educated, but their parishioners are. And they come up with questions that threaten their authority and their position. They don't know how to cope with them. And we've just left it too late in training people to answer the questions. And that's why now I discover all around Australia, North America, Britain, Europe, there's a resurgence of interest among young people. Are there answers to the big questions that we ask?
You debate some of the biggest names in atheism. It seems a really sort of popular forum to pit one against the other. A few years ago in this country, we had Richard Dawkins, I think, against Archbishop George Pell, who's now in Rome. Does that kind of discussion yield anything? Does anyone get their minds changed? Does anyone learn from that approach, do you think?
Yes, they do. Unequivocally, they do. It was rather funny when I debated Christopher Hitchens at the Edinburgh Festival, which was an amazing thing. The Edinburgh Festival wanted a God thing at the beginning. Perhaps I shouldn't tell this story, but it's occurred to me. Christopher Hitchens and James Naughtie, who you probably know as one of the leading BBC presenters, he was the moderator and he was brilliant. They came to me at the beginning and they said, we want a vote. We want a vote. And I said, really? I said, I'm not interested in a vote. Why not? Well, I said, I want to just go out there and I hope present a credible alternative to what Christopher's going to say and let the people judge. Oh, we want a vote, you see. So I said, okay. So Nachti at the beginning said, who's for the motion? The motion was a very strange one. The new Europe should prefer the new atheism, which was a bit odd because it was the new Europe was formed out of rejecting what atheism had erected. But apart from that, which gave me a trump card, of course. But so they had a vote. Who's for the motion? Who's against the motion? Who's neutral? Well, at the end, James Naughty repeated this. And to my utter surprise, to everybody's surprise, a significant proportion, it was visibly obvious, had moved over to my side. So James said, shall I count again, Christopher? And Christopher was wonderful. He said, no, he's won. So I got up and shook his hand. And he said, I want a return match. In America, no vote. But that's just the light-hearted side of it. Which shows, incidentally, that with a formidable opponent like that, you can have a very friendly relationship.
Well, I was going to ask you that.
Absolutely.
Did you get on well with him?
I did, yes. And, you know, we couldn't have been more poles apart. But my heart went out to him. Let me be very honest. I meet a man who's been a war correspondent. He's gone around the world observing Sikhs, cutting the throats of Muslims, cutting the throats of Christians, you know, and Hindus and so on. And I can see why he reacts so viscerally against the violence that is caused in the name of religion. Secondly, when I learned that as a young man, he was called upon to identify the dead body of his mother who'd entered a suicide pact with a defrocked priest. You know, I say, well, what would you have been like if that was your experience of religion? So I have great sympathy for him. I've read a lot of his stuff and so on, and I could get on with him very well. But in the final, just quick answer to what it's worth, I get dozens and dozens of letters from people who've come to faith in God and in Christ through watching the debates. So at that level, I'm just massively encouraged that it's made some little contribution to that.
There's a question from the audience about other planets, and it's interesting because last week I had the joy to interview the astronaut who sung Space Oddity. And
oh, really?
Yeah,
he
was a YouTube phenomenon,
yes,
you know, went viral.
Yes, yes.
And he had a really interesting, he didn't want to talk about his religious beliefs as such, but he said that it was hard when you were up there, out there, looking down at Earth, to imagine that this was random. And a question from the audience asks, if life exists on other planets, how do we reconcile this with the Bible and our understanding of God?
Well, I had an experience like you, perhaps not so striking, because I had a big musical event in Scotland recently with someone who piloted the space shuttle up to the space station. And he said exactly the same thing. It's very interesting, you know. As a boy, I remember, because I'm interested in astronomy, I have a telescope. And in Armagh, there's one of the oldest observatories. It's not a very big one. Patrick Moore used to be there. But I remember the astronomer for Ireland was, and I said to him, sir, and I was only a little boy, I said, as you watch the universe night after night, does it ever occur to you there's anything behind it? And he looked down at me. He was a very nice man. He said, I've watched it night after night. And he said, the impression grows, this cannot be all there is, you see. So if there's life on other planets, does that affect my understanding of the Bible? Not in the slightest. I don't believe the Bible tells us everything about the universe. It tells us what we need to know. Now, the interesting thing about the Bible is it hints that this world is not the only one that exists. That's very clear. Christ went into another world. Now, where that is and what its relationship to this world is a different matter altogether. Perhaps our understanding of mathematical dimensions helps us to do that. But Paul Davis is a well-known Australian. You've probably interviewed him. And he wrote this book, Are We Alone? And I had a radio discussion with him on this, you see. I find Paul very interesting. He writes brilliantly. He was an examiner. I've known him for some years in a little way. And he said with his heart, he would like to think we're not alone. But with his head as a scientist, he thinks we're alone, you see. And he was interviewed first because it was his book being launched. And then I was asked the question, did I think there was life elsewhere in the universe? And I said, well, yes, there's one very big one, and he's called God. So I do believe there's life out there, of course, but what out there means I don't know. So it's one of those things where I am simply agnostic. I don't know. But I don't think it affects my understanding of the Bible, because God hasn't told us all that there is to know, I'm sure.
Another question from the audience asks, why would God be good? And that sort of brings to mind a lot of the things that we're seeing around us in the news at the moment, terrible tragedies, people dying in awful ways. And of course, there's nothing new. This happens at various times in history. There are disasters when planes go missing or they crash. Why would God be good?
That's, I think, as I hinted before, the hardest question we face. And I understand why people become atheists because of it. I've been to Auschwitz many times and wept every time. I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake hit. I had to meet wives who'd lost their husbands. I had to speak at a church on the Sunday afterwards. And that was a very daunting experience. Now, this topic is very difficult and sensitive because it has two sides. Cancer looks very different to a professor of oncology and to a young mother who's just told she's 6 weeks to live. There's an intellectual side that the oncologist has got to deal with, but boy, is there a pastoral side. So I don't want to be insensitive, because I have many friends who've lost all their relatives, for instance, in the gas chambers and all sorts of horrible things. Now, many of my colleagues will say, okay, there's some evidence of intelligence up there, but please don't talk to me about a good and personal God. You insult me. So I say, okay, you become an atheist because of that. And in one sense, you feel you've solved the problem. Dawkins thinks he solved the problem, for example, because he says this universe is just bleak. It's what you'd expect to find. If at bottom, there's no good, no evil, and no justice. DNA just is. And we dance to his music. Of course, what I note there is he's abolished all morality. And then he criticizes God for being evil when he's lost the concept of evil. Now, that is a philosophical issue that I could go into. But what I notice is this, that if you take the atheist route because of that, I'll understand you in a way. But I notice you haven't solved the problem. The suffering's still there. The pain is still there. And indeed, you could have arguably made it 10,000 times worse. Because now you've no hope. The one thing that solution does, it may be the right one, but it's removed hope. So I then rephrase it and say, look, I have the problem of pain and suffering. The two problems, they're different. Moral evil and natural evil. Because I'm a Christian. So how do I face it? And I've had to face it. Because unless you can say something, now there's something I'm going to say, I don't mean to be understood as a kind of simplistic answer. It's a window into a possibility. Let me put it as modestly as that. But you see, as I look at this, I ask myself the question, we can argue, and we've all done it. a good God should, might, would, could, must, etc., etc. We've all got our ideas of God. We burn the midnight oil. I've never found that argument satisfactory. I've never found anybody that has. There's a ragged edge left. We just feel we haven't solved it. The reason for that is that I feel life is a bit like two cathedrals. Coventry Cathedral or Dresden and Christchurch Cathedral in New Zealand. You look at them, you see immediately that something awful has hit them. There's been damage. You see the traces of a former beauty. In Coventry Cathedral, we could argue that's moral evil. Dresden Cathedral similarly. Christchurch Cathedral, natural evil. So we face a world in which there's beauty and barbed wire. There's wonder and magnificence, and there are bombs and beheadings. So what are we going to do? Now, the heart of the Christian faith is a cross. And it's here I begin to see a possibility. Now, it's very hard for many people to follow this, but it's important, I think, to see what Christianity says before you reject it. I understand God to be like Jesus Christ, who is God incarnate. So, as I watch him on the cross, I say, what is God doing on a cross? And at the very least, it seems to me, that God has not remained distant from the problem of suffering, but has himself become part of it. He understands. That's point one. Point two is this. It didn't stop there. The resurrection means that death isn't the end. There is to be a judgment. And that's not a negative thing. That's a wonderful thing. It means our conscience is not an illusion. Those women who screamed their way to death in the gas chambers, wanting justice but never getting it. You see, let me be blunt with you. If atheism is true, the vast majority of people who've ever lived are never going to see justice. They're never going to see it in this life, and since there's no life to come, they're never going to see it. I believe, in spite of all these problems, that there will be a day in which God will perfectly judge the world and right will be done and seen to be right. And it's because of that hope I feel I can at least begin to address this problem without avoiding it.
I find that extremely complex, given that
it is very complex.
That idea of judgment.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit more. Let's tease that out a bit. Judgment that we will all witness somehow, or we will know in the afterlife.
There's a famous statement by Abraham that surely the judge of all the earth will do right. And one of the New Testament claims about the resurrection, and incidentally, Paul first made this claim in a philosophical court in Athens. God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness. That's the key thing. Trouble is, when we mention the word judgment, we have a very grim, black, negative idea of it, because our picture of judgment is negative and grim. But God's judgment is a magnificent thing, because it's doing justice and vindicating. And therefore I believe that in some way, I can't spell out the details, of course I can't, but the promise is there that God will do right. And therefore, let me put it the other way around. I suspect, I can't prove this to you, but if we could see what God eventually does with people who've suffered innocently, our questions would stop. I believe in a God of compensation. Otherwise, the whole thing dissolves. If this really is a moral universe and our conscience is not playing tricks with us, then there's got to be a final sorting out of things. That makes sense. See, this is where I so part company with someone like Richard Dawkins saying there is no justice. Because if there is no justice and we're dancing to our DNA, then if my dancing to my DNA means cutting a fellow human being's head off and waving it around, who shall blame me? That's the end of morality. And therefore, I fear for our society here that we are in danger with the ideas of actually undercutting the morality that we desperately need to function as a society. We've lost the vertical dimension, and we're going to pay the price for it. But that's another subject.
Well, many people behave in a moral way. Many people are moral and extremely ethical without belief in God.
Of course they are. That's because they're made in God's image from where I sit. But that's not the problem the question we were talking about. It was the question of those who have been where behavior to them has been utterly evil and totally disproportionate, and where there's been extreme pain and suffering. That's what we're talking about. I'm not questioning that. I do, of course, as I said before, question whether that's enough for God. I don't think it is. But it's good.
Another question from the audience: does not naturalism rather than supernaturalism resound with more resonance as an underpinning to science if one is being intellectually honest?
No. It's the other way round. You see, my argument, which I just began in the last part of my lecture, is that if you're to believe in rationality at all, you've got to believe that rationality is to a large extent supernatural. Forget God for the moment. You see, this is the fascination of this, that the mental is not reducible to the physical. So naturalism begins to show signs of leaking here. And again, I owe this to Lewis, whose work was sadly ignored. He points out that if, you see, we are to explain things simply naturally by cause and effect from physics and chemistry, then that empties, always say, of meaning. So I think exactly the other way round. We need supernaturalism to defend science. In other words, putting that the other way, one of the biggest evidences for me as a scientist that God exists is the fact that I can do science, that we are rational beings. We're not just the product of a cause and effect chain that leads right down to the very start without reduction.
You have to be quite brief on this next question because it could possibly be broad.
I promise.
I've got a timer on you. How do you reconcile the creation story with evolution theory? You've got 30 seconds.
Well, the short answer to that is, depends what you mean by evolution. If you mean what Darwin saw, that's not controversial. He saw change and so on, the Galapagos finches and all that kind of thing. But if you just extract to the neo-Darwinian synthesis, what is claimed is we have a mechanism, natural selection mutation, that does something. Is that an argument against the existence of a God who created that mechanism? Of course not. Just as the existence of a law of gravity is not an argument against one who created that. Now, therefore, what I'm saying is I do not believe you can deduce atheism from Darwinism, but you're asking a mathematician. And we have a lengthy track record of skepticism of the capacity of the mechanism I've just mentioned to create novel information. Now, that's a huge topic, and I simply do not see the evidence that it can. I think that what Genesis says is profound, and God said, and God said, and God said. The various steps involved input of information from outside a closed system. And I believe that that is backed up by theoretical computer science, but I'll have to stop. I've written a book on it, by the way, which people can check up on.
isn't saying, again, this is a question from the audience, isn't saying we don't know how chance can lead to the human genome, therefore God, using a God of the gaps approach.
Not at all, because the first statement is false. Chance never led to the human genome. I don't know an atheist who believes that. The age of the universe, 13.8 billion years at the common reckoning these days? You can add as many zeros onto that as you like. Paul Davies is the one to read there. That this idea that the origin of life, say, comes about by chance has been given up. That's the problem. Nobody knows how life originates. And it's not a God of the gaps, because the nature of the thing we're trying to explain is semiotic. It involves language. Now, if science is generalizations of our experience, empirical science, we only know of one possible source for something that is characterized by language, and that's intelligence. So my answer is, this is no more a God of the gaps than postulating an intelligence to explain the writing on that notice there, City Bible Forum. And as a scientist, I would much prefer an explanation that makes sense than one that doesn't make sense. And Paul Davies, who's not a theist, says you can give up this idea of chance and permutations of molecules and all of that, because the thing that's before us is something that exhibits a linguistic sequence. It's about information. And here's the supreme irony of 21st century science. We've come to see that information is a fundamental quantity. And an increasing number of physicists are realizing you cannot reduce bit to it. You cannot reduce information to physics and chemistry. Well, of course, if that's true, that's the end of materialism. And so I don't see it as God of the gaps at all, although I'm constantly accused of it. What I would say, referring to the preceding question, is we've got an awful lot of evolution of the gaps around. And some leading scientists are getting very irritated with it. Robert Laughlin won the Nobel Prize for biology. He's not a Christian, he's not a theist, but he says, I'm fed up with evolution being used as a non-theory. And he gives examples. He said, your mess of proteins becomes a chicken. Evolution did it. He says this is an excuse for having a theory. It's an evolution of the gaps. And I think that's more widespread than a God of the gaps.
We're coming to the last, probably the last 10, 12 minutes of our discussion. I've got a few more questions from the audience, but I just wanted to ask you, when we were talking earlier about characters who are able to sort of, okay, I'm thinking about Lawrence Krauss and people of that ilk. They use social media and I suppose the modern media very, very successfully. I wonder, do you find that messages in the world today, the way the media moves, the way, I suppose, long form and newspapers are in somewhat of a decline, the fact that people get most of their information quickly and off the internet, does this help dilute or ruin the message?
Well, the trouble is I'm very old. And so as a bird watcher, I think tweeting is something done by birds. And I have to have people who tweet for me. I still don't quite understand what it is. But I do think compressing our understanding of the universe into messages of 160 characters long is skillful. A recipe for absolute intellectual devastation, frankly. The attention span is just a few seconds unless you're watching rugby or football. I notice that. Students can't pay attention. Audiences are always fiddling with an electronic gadget. They can't listen to a talk that lasts for more than a few seconds. Well, we'll simply... Well, there's a wonderful book by an American called Entertaining Ourselves to Death. And I think we may well be doing that. There's information, but we've no idea how to process it. It's instantly accessible, and that can be confused with knowledge and even more with wisdom. So I just love to see us getting back to teaching people at school to think for a start, and to ask questions, and to have put them in a Faraday cage, if you like, so that the signals can't get out. Just give them a bit of space that's electronic free. But, I'm glad some of you think that. But, I mean, I look back to my childhood. We had a thing called a family meal. Most people have never heard of it. And that idea of discussion and thinking and so on, remove that from a society, and I think it becomes an infinitely poor society. And we can see that when the word that's used most often is boring, you know you're in for big trouble.
I've obviously struck a bit of a nerve here, I think. Would that be fair?
Well, my heart goes out to young people. I look back at my own life, which has been enormously privileged. Boring has never been on the agenda, and I see them aimlessly, and I see the danger that they get into. They live in a very different world from the one I grew up in. I mean, in our world, we're only one click from disaster. I didn't grow up in a world like that. And so one would like to encourage. I mean, I think the question is being asked because somebody else is worried too. I'm not the only one.
Well, it just seems to me in today's world, it's quite hard to, most pieces that you read have got somebody's argument, they've got the opposing argument. You can read through the article and not quite know what you've just read. And I wondered, particularly in the whole discussion about God and science, is that argument beholden to, good spruikers on one side and good spruikers on the other side? And, what do you get in the middle?
I will constantly maintain, I think, in spite of the difficulties and the interference and the noise and all of that, that it's worth putting out the argument from both sides, because I think, and this full audience is evidence of it, people are genuinely interested in. It is a fog. I use the analogy of a fog, and there is a lot of confusing stuff, but I have sufficient confidence in people, their resilience and their interest to, if they're serious, to manage to find a way through this fog. And I want, in whatever little way I can, to help clarify the ideas so that they can at least see what they're talking about.
I'm not trying to turn this into a plug for your books, but
Well,
if you
don't.
were... If a young person came up to you this evening and was to ask you for 5 influential books that would possibly help others gain understanding, do you know what you would say?
Oh, yes. Well, the first book I would say is the Bible, and I don't mean that in a kind of desert island situation, because I meet many people who've never read it as adults at all. And so I encourage them to take something like the Gospel of John and read it and ask their questions honestly and openly if they want to find out, because we can't decide about these things unless we have some knowledge about them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there have been various people. C.S. Lewis has influenced me massively in both understanding my own language. But you see, I don't know what it's like to be an adult and an atheist. He did. And he was my guide to the inside, an insider guide to what it feels like to be an atheist. And so I feel that he had, amazingly, a profound understanding of science, which is why many scientists hate him, because he saw the issues very clearly. And all of his books in different ways have been, but if I were to choose one for the contemporary world, it would be one of the shortest ones, The Abolition of Man, where he saw so presciently in 1940 that if we continue sowing the ideas we're sowing through our educational system, we will destroy humanity. Now there, of course, he was building on Nietzsche, who was a hard atheist. Dawkins and co. are not hard atheists. They want to maintain a Western liberal democracy and still be atheists. And Nietzsche would say, you're fooling yourselves. You cannot retain that and jettison God. As many of my Russian friends, and I spent a lot of time there, would say, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings, but we found we couldn't. So Lewis has been a very big influence on me there. I found books on history very important, on the understanding of history, because, well, you know from your journalism world that totalitarian regimes rewrite history. So it's very important to get to know about history. There are loads of very good historical books, just the history of science for me in particular, to dispel the myths. Like, you know, Galileo and the church, wasn't that terrible? And you realize actually that that is a myth that's been perpetuated and it's almost completely false. Galileo was hounded by the philosophers, first of all, not the church. And he was a believer in God who got it right. He wasn't an atheist, and so on. So correcting historical misapprehension has been very important for me, learning a bit about the history of science. But I read so many books. I think one of the recent ones that has really impacted me is the one by Thomas Nagel, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the Universe is Almost Certainly False. I mean, that's hit the cyber world like a nuclear bomb, because he's a very serious thinker. And I find it so refreshing when this aggressive type of new atheism, which tries simply to destroy religion by rhetoric, by strong language and so on, and not really by intelligent argument, is beginning to be replaced by a more reflective type of thing that Thomas Nagel's doing.
Do you have a favorite atheist?
Do I have a favorite atheist? Well, I know so many delightful atheists. You see, I've been privileged to debate them. Peter Millikan, who's professor of philosophy in Oxford, the late Christopher Hitchens. I just had a debate with Michael Tooley and so on. I had a very interesting debate with Peter Singer. And, you know, I don't work in terms of favorites. I've learned something from each of these people. And I just hope I learn a bit more. So no real favorites.
Well, Professor John Lennox, it's been such a pleasure, and thanks to everyone who contributed questions. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you.